Seats. Have delegates take their seats, please. We are going to go to Committee 4C, updated, please. Committee 4C, updated. And we're going to begin with a prayer in just a moment. Just a couple of quick notes. Someone found a ring, a gold ring made up of hearts. It's a woman's ring, yes. So if anyone asks you about that, let them know that one was found. One more thing, just a note of decorum again. Lots of connectivity on the floor, including Twitter and Facebook and all the rest. I just ask you again to be mindful of the process. We are the delegates. We are supposed to be acting based on the deliberations on the floor without a lot of outside influence. So use your wisdom on that. Also, once again, be mindful of your fellow delegates and their ability to focus on the work in front of them. We're going to take up Advisory Committee 4C, Congregational Support Ministry, specifically the Doctrine of Discovery Task Force. Okay, and we're going to do one quick thing before that. We have a quick vote we need to take. But before we go any further, I'd like to ask Brother Mark Charles to offer our prayer before we get into this afternoon's business. Thank you, Mark.
Yat Mark Charles Inashia, Sin Bake Danan the Shlin, the Tohiglini Bashichin, Sin Bake Danan Bashiche, the Tohichini Bashanella. In the Navajo culture, when you introduce yourself, you always give your 4 clans. My mother's mother, which is your identity in the Navajo culture, is actually American of Dutch heritage, May Nadelborg, May Witteveen, actually Nadelborg by marriage. So when I introduce myself, I say Tsin Bake de Ne'a, which literally translated means the wooden shoe people. My father's mother is Toa Higlini, which is the waters that flow together. My mother's father, my 3rd clan, is also Tsin Bake de Ne'a. And my 4th clan, my father's father's Todachitni, which is the Bitterwater clan, one of the original clans of our Navajo tribe. My father's in the back seat, in the back row there. I'd just like to honor him, who's here with me today. I grew up in the traditional lands of our Navajo people, and I've lived on our reservation for the past decade. And whenever I go to visit an elder or a people of my community, I always bring a gift of food. And so before we go any further, I want to ask if there are any people of Anishinaabe, of Potawatomi, or of the Hopewell tribe who might be in our attendance this afternoon. These were the 3 tribes, 3 of the tribes that were cleansed from this land after the Removal Act of 1830. These were the people who lived here along the river. These were the people who made the mounds that were later leveled so that downtown Grand Rapids could be built. These were the people that we talked about in the blanket exercise that were violently and oppressively removed from this land so that the settlers could come in here. I would like to ask everyone to stand and just to bow your head in a moment of silence as we honor and remember the people of this land, some of which are still alive today and have been moved to reservations elsewhere so that even this campus could be built. We'll just take a moment of silence. Ahiahat. my Anishinaabe, Potawatomi, Hopewell, and other tribal people who have stewarded this land for hundreds, some even thousands of years. You have done well with what Creator asked you to care for, and we honor you for the way you stewarded this land. You may sit down. Whenever I visit my relatives and my elders on the reservation, I said I always bring a gift of food. And on the Navajo reservation, that usually means a 50-pound bag or a 25-pound bag of bluebird flour. I can't travel with that very well anymore. So I always also like to bring a gift of coffee. And so Starbucks makes these great Via packets that are very easy to fit into a suitcase. And so I always try to bring these and give these during protocol time with indigenous peoples and leaders and tribal people wherever I go. And so because there are no Anishinaabe or Potawatomi or Hopewell people here, I'm going to leave this packet of coffee underneath the flowers here, just as a way of honoring the people who are on this land before we got here. And if it's gone by the end of the day, because it's Starbucks and we're in a room full of Americans, I will know it was stolen. So,
Thank you, Mark.
now let's bow our heads in prayer. Creator, God of the universe, maker of heaven and earth, the one who causes the sun to rise and the one who allows it to set, the one who causes the rain to fall on the righteous and the unrighteous alike, the one who made creation and it was good, the one who after his creation rebelled, sent his only son that we might be covered by his blood so we could have relationship with him, with you. Creator of the universe, we love you. We are honored and humbled at the privilege we have of every breath that we take, knowing that we have earned nothing, that we deserve nothing, that we are justified by nothing other than your mercy, your grace, and the blood of your Son. Creator, we are going to have a conversation right now that we don't know what to do with. We went through a blanket exercise just a few days ago that taught us how violently and oppressively and in dehumanizing ways this land was not discovered, but it was taken. People were cleared, ethnicities were cleansed, boarding schools were set up, and we confess, Father, we don't know what to do with that. We don't know what to do with the fact that our governments literally committed genocide on our behalf so that we could sit here. We don't know what that means for us as a church because it was your church that wrote that doctrine. We don't know what to do with that. We don't know what that means. We don't know what justice looks like when the very land we're sitting on was stolen. Father, this is a difficult, challenging conversation. It will bring up fears of defensiveness. It will bring up a desire to justify ourselves. It will bring up a desire to let our intentions be known that they were not evil. It will bring up a desire to point to the things that by grace you have allowed to happen. It will bring up fear. It will bring up anger. It will bring up shame. But it will not. These will all be challenges to us having real conversation and truly finding a way to be reconciled, to have conciliation with one another and reconciliation with you. So, Father, I ask that you set all of these things aside. I ask that for the next several hours, we will remember that we are justified by one thing and one thing alone, which is the blood of your Son, Jesus. Good intentions don't count. Your grace doesn't justify us. And it's because of your Son, Jesus, that we can confront and look and listen to the people who were oppressed and hear the stories and have the conversation. Because we're not standing on our own actions. We're not standing on our own history. We're not sitting there because we're good enough or because we're justified to be there. We are standing there only because of the Son and the blood of your Son, Jesus Christ. And that is the only reason. May we not forget that, Father. Father, I pray for our native peoples who are in the room, as some of this history will bring back memories of oppression, of violence, of stories they heard from their grandparents, as they feel shame because they do not speak their language, as they feel embarrassed because they don't understand the rules in this linear society. Father, we pray that you will bring healing. We pray that our oneness may not come through assimilation. Our oneness will come through celebrating the discomfort that comes from the diversity that you created and that you affirmed at Pentecost when you allowed the gospel to be preached in every language. You allowed your disciples to speak the languages of the nations, affirming the diversity that you created and put into your world. Father, we need help having this conversation. We don't know how to do it. We are afraid. We are scared. We are traumatized. And we ask that your will be done. Yahat. 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 Yahat.
Amen. Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it. We are going to Advisory Committee 4C. Hold the ballot. I'm sorry. Our Executive Director, Steve Timmermans.
One very quick, simple thing. In the union of the Home Missions and World Missions agencies into one, there have been many, many, many details, and there will continue to be. And one of those details is ensuring we have a board for the new agency. When you voted earlier, as Synod began, on boards and committees, there was an omission. For Region 6, the new missions agency needs a board member. So if you go to the, it's the ballot part on the right side of your screen, or is it voting? It's one of those, voting. And then you get to the next page, and about, 5 or 6 choices down, it's called ballot for boards and committees. And when you click on that, there will be one ballot for Region 6, 2 individuals. Please take a moment, read it quickly, please, and choose one. Thank you. And by the way, as Synod concludes, all of the results of your voting, done now and then previously, will be brought forward to the body.
Steve, quick one more time. Walk everyone through in case anyone missed it, just
Okay.
where they need to go.
Okay, so voting on the main page, click voting. Then you'll be brought to a page with a number of options. It's about the 5th or 6th option down, called Ballot for Boards and Committees. Ballot for Boards and Committees. When you click on that, you'll be brought immediately to the Region 6 ballot with bio information on both nominees, and then if you scroll all the way to the bottom, a yes or a place to vote.
Thank you, and it is just that one vote. Once you finish doing that, make sure you are at Advisory Committee 4C, updated, should say updated on it. That is what is before us. This committee has done much good work working alongside the Doctrine of Discovery Task Force report. You see the privilege of the floor that's already been granted there to the chair, and the chair has said that he is resting in the recommendations of the advisory committee, which is just language to indicate that they are going to present this report together. This does not mean that everything that's in this report is necessarily agreed to by those from the Doctrine of Discovery Task Force. It simply means we'll work through the advisory committee's proposals as they come. But the chair of the Doctrine of Discovery Task Force is going to begin us with the process. So please, if you haven't already, finish up your voting, draw your attention to the Doctrine of Discovery, and I turn it over to you, Mike. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first time at a synod, it's been an experience with you. Like my brother Mark, I acknowledge the Anishinaabe forebears on this land. My name is Mike Hogaterp. I worship at Barhaven Fellowship Christian Reformed Church, which is on unceded Algonquin territory. It's been a privilege and an incredible honor to walk on a learning journey, on a spiritual journey with my sisters and brothers on the Doctrine of Discovery Task Force. Ours has been an intense journey in the circle. And I think some of the struggles you have delegates have had over these last several days, the circle may have been a benefit to you. We're not going to insert any complexity into the mix now and suggest you enter into circle as the body. That wouldn't be very productive, I think. But alas, we offer to you the beauty of the circle. Our deliberations and our report were formed in intensive circle time together where we shared our hearts as brothers and sisters in Jesus Christ. We are incomplete as single people. We are more complete together as a diverse body, and we've experienced that in what I'd call the crucible of reconciliation in our very task force. Reconciliation is a beautiful journey and a painful one that we join by learning stories. And the honor to hear stories has been profound to us. And I'd like to tell you one. It's been my honor to work in the Canadian ecumenical context for many years now. And that often puts me in contact with Indigenous elders and church leaders. One of them is Jillian Harris, who's an elder from a First Nations community on Vancouver Island. And Jillian and I worked on an ecumenical committee together for many years. And I had no idea that Jillian was a survivor of the Mission Residential School in Mission, BC. I was privileged to attend the Truth and Reconciliation Commission national event in Vancouver, British Columbia. And unbeknownst to me, my sister Jillian walked up to the stage in a commissioner's sharing panel and shared her story. She told a horrific story of abuse, sexual, emotional, cultural. And after she spoke her truth, she spoke one final truth. She said directly to her perpetrator, who was not in the room, I assume, but to her perpetrator, she said, "I forgive you. And I do that because of Jesus Christ. And I hope that someday you will have the courage to forgive yourself and live in the same freedom that I have today." Isn't that grace, friends? It is. In the process of our work, as you may know, we as a task force have been honored to hear testimony from courageous Indigenous people. We honor the truth that Susie Silversmith speaks to you in the report. We honor the truth of stories too delicate to be heard publicly that you've seen referred to in your report. And we honor the truths of stories yet to be told because of fear. May our actions as the family of the body of Christ today create space for the sharing of stories. And now, Mr. Chair, if I may, I have a request of a few people. My brothers and sisters on the task force, if you're in the room, if you affirm the truth of the stories that we've been gifted, would you please stand? Our brothers and sisters on the Board of Trustees and on the staff who've heard the stories to which I've referred, if you affirm those truths, would you please stand? Thank you. Stories are sacred gifts that we mustn't hold lightly. In my hands, I hold 4 stones in the colors of the 4 directions: red and yellow, black and white. I was privileged to sit in circle with Cree Elder Stan McKay for a week several years ago. And Stan carries 4 stones like this around to remind himself of the sacredness of creation and the sacredness of all God's people as image bearers of Him. I hold these stones to honor that reality, and I'm pleased that the reporter has agreed to hold these stones. As you deliberate, I ask that you adopt a similar posture of honoring these stones as a representation of what I've just said. In the course of the last 3.5 years, our task force has wrestled with the complex foundational phenomena called the doctrine of discovery. We've come to understand that doctrine as foundational to the settlement of North America and a deep moral wound that has demeaned the image of God in people. Our mandate has asked us to probe a troubling history and to understand the historical and contemporary effects of the doctrine of discovery. This is a difficult and necessary exercise. We don't like to hear hard stories, but we drink downstream from these. We drink downstream from hard stories and the corporate sins across generations. We cannot change that brokenness today. But perhaps in truth-telling and lament as a first posture, we can begin to heal together as a new and reconciled family of Jesus Christ, our brother. That's why this report is called Creating a New Family. From the beginning of our work as a task force, we've been encircled together and we've agreed that a good result of our work within the church would be an ongoing conversation about the doctrine and its impact on us as a church and us as nations and cultures. In our historic research and in our listening to the stories around the continent, we've learned that the doctrine of discovery influences us both historically and presently. And now I must be candid with you. We know that controversy has been part of the way our report has been received. And some of that controversy certainly comes from the southwestern U.S. And that pain is something we understand. We know that reconciliation is a crucible. We need to say straight away that as we deliberate, I would stress to you that the doctrine of discovery and its impacts on us as a body are not exclusively focused on the mission to the southwest of the United States. The doctrine of discovery impacts us all as we've just named the land. Many of us in North America live and worship on unceded land. That's just one example. Indigenous people in the U.S. are incarcerated at a higher rate even than that of African Americans. In Canada, the Indigenous people are overrepresented in the prison system to the tune of 4-to-1 at some points. This is a legacy that has a wide reach. So I urge you to consider that wide reach in your deliberations. Now, I can tell you that this process has been an enormously difficult one, some of the hardest work that I've ever done personally. But in the arguing and in the tears, in the sharing and the laughter in a circle, we as a task force believe that we've been drawn into a spiritual journey of hearing each other as broken and healing members of the body of Christ. As you, Mr. Chair, as Synod deliberate, it's our hope that you and the Church will experience the beauty and challenge of wrestling graciously with hard questions in this metaphorical circle today, and that you would experience that work as the body of Christ. I defer to the reporter.
Thank you, Mike.
It feels odd, to say the least, to speak into this issue at all when I stand here as a person of immense privilege. I am a white, middle-aged male. I have not personally experienced disadvantage as a result of supposedly Christian doctrine made by a supposedly Christian leader hundreds of years ago. Quite the contrary. Because people who claim to be of the same faith I profess made certain declarations about that faith, and because many generations of white Europeans have lived to varying degree either in ignorance or worse, I was and still am, in some ways, many ways, a man of tremendous privilege, inheriting that from my forebears, inheriting that privilege from, at least in part, supposedly Christian doctrines with which I cannot agree. Doctrines that appear to me to have been excuses that allowed my culture to reach out and dominate indigenous peoples throughout the world, not just in North America, but in South America, in Africa, in Asia, all over the world. My family on my mother's side, my mother's mother's side, traces its genealogy at least back to 1653, when my forebearer, Peter Quackenbush, yes, that was our family's name, settled in the United States. My family has directly benefited from what is now known sometimes as the doctrine of discovery for 363 years, consciously or unconsciously. We have benefited from this crutch of a doctrine used to excuse our actions in dominating and conquering people created equally to me in God's image. It also feels odd to stand here because it seems to me that there is more to the story of the doctrine of discovery and its fallout in my life, and in the lives of my indigenous brothers and sisters. It is also true that in spite of the sin of my forebears, and in spite of my own sin, either of omission or commission, God has worked his grace in many ways. In the work of many individuals and groups, God has brought the gospel to many peoples in spite of errors, underlying wrong thinking and worldview, and even in spite of outright sinful behaviors. Speaking as a person of privilege, please hear this plea. Do not allow yourselves to see either the DOCD task force report or the advisory committee recommendations as being primarily about the CRC's mission to the Navajo and Zuni. That would be to give a grave disservice to all parties involved. And please hear this plea, drawn from communications received by members of Classis Red Mesa and attached to their overture. Our oneness in Jesus Christ must be the goal of any reconciliation process. Let us seek humility, patience, understanding, and grace when dealing with the past. Let us share the stories of racism and hurt and learn how to reconcile without attacking the motives of Christian and brothers and sisters who precede us. Let us honor Christ and his church by forging lifetime relationships with people of different culture, colors, and tongues. You have before you, I hope, and will soon have on the screen, the recommendations of Advisory Committee 4C. Our recommendations for privilege of the floor having already been granted, I recommend the first recommendation under Section C, which is that Synod acknowledge the need for great sensitivity, discernment, and long-term commitment in addressing the legacy of the doctrine of discovery, particularly in addressing CRCNA mission work among Indigenous people. So moved.
Recommendation number 1 is before us. It's on the floor. We will open a queue for speakers if anyone wants to speak. Gerald Koning.
My name is Jerry Koning. I'm from Classis Georgetown. I just want to commend the task force for all the beautiful work that you did and the difficult work that you did. This is not the first time something like this has come here. It certainly hasn't been under the doctrine of discovery. But way back, many times it's come, what are we doing in the Southwest to really bring people together into the church and into an indigenous church. And before this very assembly in 1945, there was a board member, the Board of Missions member, that came with a particular protest. And in that protest, this person said, on the advanced program, that is the missionary program, submitted to the board and synod in 1945, were 6 items for the Indian field. First among these is the establishment of native churches. But the tragedy is that this first point is so encumbered by additions and practically so overshadowed by other features that it cannot possibly come into its own. Because of recent agitation, it does not receive a great deal of discussion and even emphasis on the field or by the board. For every dollar that is put into it, that is the evangelistic program, 10 is spent on the educational fund, that is the boarding schools. So in spite of avowed intentions to increase and strengthen the gospel work, the report proves that we are still leaning in every heavier on the broken reed of educational methods practices. In considering these 6 points, the board's program can hardly restrain the question, what have we then? A self-governing, self-supporting, self-propagating church, as is the board ideal of the board and synod, or a puppet regime that perhaps quite willingly carries out our mandate, but is wholly subservient to us and dependent on us because saddled down with so heavy with burdens of our making as to make an indigenous church utterly impossible. That was 71 years ago at this very floor of synod. What have we after 71 years? We have a world-class Christian school, a couple of them, Zuni and Rehoboth. But what do we have as far as an indigenous church? You could say self-propagating, self-supporting, and self-governing. And I think there is so much more to what has happened there, and so I can't necessarily contain it in the doctrine of discovery, but maybe it's in our inability to contextualize the gospel into the context of the countries, the places, the peoples, the situation where he've come. I was the chair of the World Missions Advisory Committee, and Moses Chung told us a few statistics about the Christian Reformed churches. He said 5% of our Christian Reformed churches today are growing by evangelism. 10% are growing by way of transfer. 55% of our Christian Reformed churches are static or declining. 25% of our Christian Reformed churches are declining rapidly, and 5% of our Christian Reformed churches will die in 5 years. I believe largely because we haven't learned how to take the gospel of Jesus Christ and contextualize it into our day and into our context. And so when this says we need to learn from the doctrine of discovery for a long time, I think we need to learn how that whole doctrine of discovery and our ethnocentrism and our inability to make the gospel contextual, as Paul says, being a Jew to the Jews, being all things to all people, has hampered us, not only in our mission to the natives, indigenous people in the Southwest, but also to our people in our backyard, and to the people around me in Jenison and in Granville. And unless we learn from this going forward, we won't have the church that's able to preach the gospel to the people in their context so that they can hear it. Thank you so much for bringing this to our attention, and I hope we will never forget it but repeat it until we know how to bring the gospel to all the nations in all the languages in a way they can understand. Thank you.
Thank you. Chelsea and then John.
Chelsea Harmon, classes BC Northwest, and in particular, I live on the traditional territory of the Snuneymuxw people. I always say it wrong. I'm just curious, we are saying that we acknowledge the need for long-term commitment. Are we, by saying so, that we are making a long-term commitment in addressing the legacy of the doctrine of discovery? Mr. Chair, could I get clarification?
Mm-hmm. Can you give her that clarification?
Yeah, it is my understanding that, acknowledging the need for sensitivity and discernment and long-term commitment would be, committing us to this for the long term.
And how will we know the plans for that commitment?
Well, see, we didn't want to, as a committee, and you may see this throughout the document, we didn't want to get too specific on what precise commitments we were looking at for a couple of reasons. Primary among those reasons was that I don't want this to sound like an excuse or anything like this. We recognize that as a committee, we don't really have the right to sort of impose specifics in terms of reconciling process upon peoples who have suffered the hurt. So it would be, we felt, just kind of repeating the sins of the fathers, as it were, to come down as the, quite honestly, largely white European Christian Reformed Church and say to our Zuni and Navajo brothers and sisters, hey, look, we're going to engage in reconciliation, and this is what it's going to look like. And so you will see as we move on, I hope, that there is definitely a commitment to talk with and work with indigenous peoples in Zuni and Navajo territory, but also to continue the dialogue that has been started in First Nations communities with the Christian Reformed Church in Canada, and then wherever else God calls us to participate in this kind of work. And so we didn't choose to get super specific on some of this.
Thank you, Daniel. John?
John Maidendorp, classes Huron. My comments echo the previous comments that have been made, but it's great that we acknowledge the need for sensitivity, discernment, and long-term commitment. The report of the study committee, which I commend you for, it's excellent work. proposes some very specific ways that the denomination could commit to sensitivity, discernment, and long-term commitment. Items G through K of the task force report are specific instructions to the Board of Trustees to encourage agencies and congregations and communities to continue having these conversations. In particular, one thing about the report that really jumped out at me and really spoke to me and touched my heart was the call of this report for us as the united people of God to come together to write a common story, to write a story that reflects the journey that we have walked together. And that item is addressed particularly in recommendation K of the study committee report, of the task force report on page 541 of the Synod agenda. And if you don't mind, Mr. President, I would like to read that recommendation.
You may.
Recommendation K of the Doctrine of Discovery Task Force states that Synod encourage the development of a common story with our Indigenous neighbors by encouraging agencies, congregations, and affiliated educational institutions to celebrate with thankfulness to God that Indigenous cultures and languages have persisted despite grave opposition. Work with Indigenous, sorry, I got mixed up. Indigenous cultures and languages have persisted despite grave opposition. Work with Indigenous peoples and communities to build healthy and mutually supportive relationships. Encourage the development of Indigenous leadership in CRC churches and institutions. Enter into dialogue with Indigenous Christians, theologians, and church leaders about contextualization of the gospel, intercultural mission, and creational theology. And by directing the Board of Trustees to 1, form and mandate a commission chaired and led by a simple majority of Indigenous persons to design and implement a 5-year process whereby a true common story can unfold, specifically creating safe space for telling and listening to life stories of Indigenous brothers and sisters, including those arising in the context of our Indigenous mission work in the United States and Canada. 2, provide sufficient resources for this process. And 3, build on previous and similar efforts whenever possible. That's a book that I want in my office. And I think it's a recommendation that sets forth an ideal that we want to be hearing each other's stories, that we want to be working toward a common future. And to recognize, to work toward that common future, we have to recognize the past. We have to recognize the real hurt, the real difficulty, but also celebrate the fact that in spite of these challenges, in spite of these historical violences that we have committed, that God has blessed us with faithful people who want to contribute to this denomination, who love this denomination, and who want to help us grow together into a better future. So I guess my question, Mr. President, to the committee is, why were all of these very specific and very, I thought, well-grounded recommendations to the Board of Trustees completely regarded? And rather than proposing specific ways that we could move forward with sensitivity, discernment, and commitment, they simply say we ought to move forward with sensitivity, discernment, and commitment.
Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Want to respond, Daniel?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of them was what I had just said to the previous speaker, that we did not want to be too prescriptive in this, and we felt that that the committee, the task force, with all due respect to the task force, they've done some really excellent work. We felt that the task force committee team that they had prescribed various actions without necessarily fully consulting with particularly the people, the First Nations people or indigenous people who are closest to us in some ways, that is the Zuni and the Navajo, because of our connection with them in the southwestern United States. And so we didn't want to be prescriptive, we wanted to give room, but additionally, we felt that it was not right to not only be prescriptive, but also be dictating a process to a people who do not feel that they have been consulted or engaged in determining that process. And so if we had heard from Classis Red Mesa, for example, an overture which said, yes, yes, we are all in favor of the Doctrine of Discovery Task Force report recommendations, yes, please adopt it, we would probably be saying a very different story here this morning. However, we do not. Now, this, like I said before, this is not the Red Mesa report. However, our connection with the people of Classis Red Mesa, in the United States at least, is our closest connection with First Nations or indigenous peoples.
Well, I'll name the elephant in the room. The consultation process that our sisters and brothers from Red Mesa have raised had holes, which we regret deeply. And Mr. Chair, with your permission to speak to the nature of those holes, I'd ask you to grant the permission of the floor to Mark Charles.
For what purpose?
To explain the process of consultation. Mark was our key link in Red Mesa through the process.
Well, Red Mesa may speak whenever they like. They have the privilege of the floor, but we're being asked specifically about Mark Charles, a member of the committee.
Just to explain his efforts vis-a-vis communication within classes.
Please, Mark.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to share this story with incredible humility. I was born at Rehoboth. My grandparents were were translators for the missionaries at Rehoboth. My father taught at Rehoboth. I went back to Rehoboth later, and I coached at the high school, I worked at the hospital, and I led the small group ministry at the church. I was born and raised around and in and at Rehoboth. And I was pastoring a church in Denver. I was an elder at an emerging church, but anyway, I was leading the church in Denver. And we went back to the reservation. We moved back about 12 years ago, to understand better what it meant to be Native and be Christian, what it meant to be Navajo and be Christian. My family, my grandfather, my grandmother were both boarding school survivors, and they were taught that to be Christian, you had to be American. And so they did not teach my father Navajo. They did not teach my father the culture, and so he didn't know what to teach it to me. And so I grew up outside of my culture, primarily living at Rehoboth. When I went back to the reservation, I began trying to engage. I lived for 3 years in a hogan out in the middle of nowhere, 6 miles off the nearest paved road on a dirt road, no running water, no electricity. I lived with a family that wove rugs and herded sheep for a living. And while we were there, we were trying to engage dialogue of what it looked like to be Native and be Christian. How does our culture, how does our language, how does our understanding of Creator affect the way that we worship and walk with Jesus? And 3 years after that, I moved back into Window Rock, and at the at the advice and at the urging of my pastor, William Kemkes, I went before one of the committees of Red Mesa to present to them the work that I was trying to do and the things that I was working on, and to ask them to supervise me. There were several Native leaders on this council, on this committee, as well as some leaders from the dominant culture, and I shared with them some of the dialogue I was trying to have around contextualizing worship. I shared with them some of the conversation I was having around raising up younger leaders. I shared with them some of the ways I was beginning to dip my feet in the social justice and what does it mean that we are so marginalized and we have had this oppressive stance against us for so long. And I asked them to supervise, or we were proposing the idea of them supervising my work. And the committee came back to me after some deliberation, and they said to me, "We like what you're doing, but if we were to supervise you, we would have to stop you from doing most of what you're doing. And so we don't want to supervise you because we like what you're doing, but if we supervise you, we would have to stop you from doing a lot of the work that you're trying to do." And that's the challenge at Red Mesa. There are certain conversations we don't know how to have because so many of our leaders in Red Mesa are boarding school survivors themselves. There is a parental dynamic that exists that has been ingrained into their heads because of the way that they were presented the gospel. A story that I will share with you was when I was at Red Mesa and some of our emerging leaders were being examined, and there were a few Navajo leaders and there were a few non-Navajo leaders being questioned. And one of the Navajo pastors in the room, he asked one of the Navajo students, if your family came to you and they were going to have a ceremony, and they asked you to participate. I want you to think about the question last night, too. And they asked you to participate. What would you do? Now, the correct answer is I would not go. I would tell them I don't participate in my culture, and I am a Christian now, and I live with the Easter Bunny and the Christmas tree. And so the woman gave the answer that was expected. And then another Navajo woman stood up and said, I would like to hear all the Navajos answer that question. And so one by one, every single one of the Navajo leaders at the table stood up and denied their culture. I was livid. I was beside myself. And I stood up in that room and I said, because we all could ask a question, and I said, I would like to ask a question. I said, we all know that Jesus did things that the religious leaders didn't like. He hung out with prostitutes. He sat with tax collectors. He made himself unclean. He went into places where he was not supposed to go. I said, I don't want to hear where your pastor would go. I don't want to hear where you would go. I don't want to hear where your elders would go. I said, where do you think Jesus would go? How would he answer the question you were just asked? And if I remember correctly, every single one of them said he would go to the ceremony. There are dialogues we struggle deeply to have in Classis Red Mesa. We don't know how to have them. Many of you probably know Richard Twist. He spoke at the leadership here on Reformed worship. That was about 4 or 5 years ago, before he passed away. And one of our native pastors who was on the council to help set up that meeting, when he heard Richard was speaking there, he said, I have to recuse myself from this position because my people at Red Mesa will not support Richard Twist, who many believe is syncretistic. As I've tried to engage the dialogue of contextualized worship, I've had to walk this very, very, very fine line. Because not only am I dealing with a colonial church that came in and brought a certain message about what Jesus was like and what he meant. But I also have to realize I'm dealing with boarding school survivors who, by and large, many of them gave up their culture so that they could have Christ. Like my grandparents. They gave up their language. They gave up their culture. I heard one of our pastors say to our people one time, he said, you know, before we met the missionaries, we would wake up every morning and we would greet the sunrise with our prayers. And now we can't even get to church by 10 a.m. because we were told that our culture was evil and it was bad. And so there were a lot of things. So what I learned very early on as I was back on the reservation and trying to engage some of these dialogues is there are certain dialogues that are difficult, if not impossible, to have within Red Mesa. And while people from the fringes, even the leadership, will affirm these are dialogues we need to have, because what I heard from that committee that day was, we like the conversation that you're trying to bring about, but it's going to lead to a lot of heartache and pain, and someone's going to get pushed aside because of it, and when that happens, you're going to be standing alone. And I accepted that. I acknowledge that. But that's the challenge. And so as we continue to try to engage with Red Mesa, and I realized that because of my position and because of what had been said to me, I did not have the best relationships and dynamics to bring that dialogue in. Eventually, I recused myself and I said, Mike, I think you need to try and work on this, because I'm not able to bring this into the heart of Red Mesa, let alone into the broader churches within the community. So this is why I prayed even at the beginning. This is such a difficult conversation. We don't know how to have it. There is incredible pain. I completely respect the fact that Red Mesa had said, we want to have more time to digest this report. I have complete and utter respect for that. James Litson has said that to me as well, one of the delegates here. I have complete and utter respect for that.
Thank you, Mark.
So as Mark mentioned, he passed off the torch, so to speak. I can't say that was a successful enterprise. I am happy to note that the blanket exercise has been used at least 2 times in recent months in Red Mesa. Previous to that, it was also used in Fort Defiance and Farmington with Harold, Mark, and I playing a role in the leadership. There's also been outreach in terms of conversation to a number of classist leaders. Those outreach attempts were not what I'd call substantive, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Rob, and then Gail.
Sorry, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
I don't want to at all waste the body's time. We've heard from the white guy, me, and another white guy, and from the task force, but we haven't heard Classes Red Mesa's perspective on this particular thing. I'm wondering, seeing if they have the privilege of the floor, if there was a representative from Classes Red Mesa who wanted to speak to this issue, if that was appropriate.
I have Rob, Gail, and Adrian. Please, Gail. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am Gail DeYoung, Classis Red Mesa, and I appreciate my brother Mark Charles' comments. I have shared a long history with the Navajo people, and I understand so many of the issues that confront us right now. I think that, and part of the thing that I have done is that I needed to listen. I needed to go to my Native American elders and ask them the questions. And I suppose in a little bit it depends on who you ask, right? It depends on your story. And so that's why it's difficult to have this consensus. I will say that in answer to what Mark has talked about, Classis Red Mesa was blindsided by this report. Our superintendent of Rehoboth Christian Schools, Carol Bramer Bennett, was completely blindsided by this. 3 members of the task force walked into her office and said, "We have this," without really ever consulting her in this conversation. To my knowledge, that is true of Zuni and to Classis leaders. I sat with the Classical Interim Committee as they drew up the overture, and again, they were blindsided by it. And so we are here today listening to one voice, but there are other voices that need to be heard. There are other people who have a vested interest in what we are doing here. And I believe we owe it to not only those people in Classis Red Mesa, but to the people whose footprints I walk in now at Rehoboth, to listen and to hear the balance of those stories. I have a Native American elder friend who I asked to read the report. 2 of them, actually. I want to tell you both. And I told this to the advisory committee as well. The one is a Lakota Indian whose great-grandfather was at Wounded Knee, one of the most tragic and horrible instances of American domination. And he said he watched as his wife and his children were thrown into a ditch. He saw them killed because the bullet that was meant for his back only grazed him. And he said to his great-grandson, "We cannot hold this bitterness, because if we do, it will forever affect us. We must forgive, because in forgiving, as our reporter said, in forgiving, we find that we are like the Christ who forgave us all." Powerful words. I sat with the Leadership Development Network, Native leaders, pastors, who one by one read the Doctrine of Discovery report. And one by one, they said, yes, this has happened, but we need to move on. And finally, my Native American elder friend who read the report, and I asked him to comment, and he said, "I only read about 3 or 4 pages." And I said, "Why?" And he said this. He said, "As long as we are looking back, we will never have a vision for the future." Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And then Adrian.
Rob Buckham, Classis, Wisconsin. I'm very hesitant to wade into this topic, so I'm just going to say, and I was hesitant to say anything, but I think a lot of the delegates may be very hesitant to say anything because we lack the knowledge and experience and really have no right to speak into it. Just a couple of observations about the report and the recommendation. I know we're on one, and all of them sort of blend together, but as an individual coming to Classis, to Synod, reading the report, and going through the blanket exercise, I have to ask for forgiveness. So that's the personal thing that I have to start with. Then I think the recommendation takes note of the fact that the CRCNA has to begin to understand this and start putting together a plan to deal with it, and that's what the recommendation says. I applaud the task force for their report. It was very hard to read, very hard to hear, and whether or not I agree with all of it, it was something that I had to read. I think our advisory committee has done a great job. And I say this with humility. You took an unbelievably difficult set of topics and worked together to find unity. And I think that in and of itself says that we can do this. We have to listen to each other. And with that kind of unity, we at least have something that we can begin to work with. I know this is not the end, it's the beginning. I have to say the task force has used great grace in deferring and trying to also listen to what the advisory committee delegates said, and also Red Mesa. I wanted to hear what Red Mesa had to say as well. I appreciate very much, my own church is very deeply involved with Rehoboth and Zuni. It's not a bias that I have. I think there's so much good. We send youth there every year, in fact, a lot of adults too, and have had a wonderful experience being there. I think there's issues about Rehoboth and Zuni that the Christian Reformed Church continues to have to look at, and that's very broad, and we're not going to resolve that here. So I want to say that I support this recommendation, and I support what the advisory committee has done, and I appreciate all the parties coming together in unity to get this done.
John Benendorp.
John Maidendorp, classes Huron. I don't know how appropriate this is, so if it is inappropriate, please tell me to sit down and shut up. I sent in a motion, and the motion has to do with recommitting the study report to the task force to report to a future synod so that they have time to further consult with the indigenous peoples in the American Southwest and come back with a more comprehensive report that reflects the intricacies of and complexities of the settler-indigenous relationships in the Christian Reformed Church. So if it's in order, I would like to make a motion to table the advisory committee report in order to take up this motion.
So what you're doing, though, is you're making a motion to table, and your intent then is to recommit it, not to the advisory committee, but to the...
To the task force.
Right. Okay. Motion has been made to table. Is it seconded? Okay, motion is made and seconded. There's no debate. You understand what we're doing? All in favor of tabling, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? I judge that motion defeated, John.
Yeah, thanks.
So we're back to the main motion. John.
John Myboom, Classes Toronto. It seems to me that the thing that I'm hearing is that while the temptation is to think that we need to do all this stuff for our Indigenous brothers and sisters' benefit, in fact, what we need to do this stuff for our own benefit and for our own learning and repentance and all of that. So it just seems that we should really, ideally, look back at some of the specific recommendations for that purpose.
All right, we have a rapidly growing list now. Jan?
Jan Van Vliet, Classes Iacota. It's been mentioned a couple of times, Mr. Chairman, that we need to come together for a true common story. That's the phrase, that's the quote, true common story. True common stories have balance, Mr. Chairman. Balance of the hurt, but also success. So if I can just change the geographical location for a minute from Southwest US to Northern Canada, where I had the great pleasure of being an economist for almost 5 years, working for the government as an advisor to the government, an economic advisor, where I spent time dealing with Indigenous peoples in negotiations with the federal government and with the provincial, the territorial governments, dealing with surface and subsurface rights. The report mentions the Erasmus family. I know them very well, having dealt and deliberated with the Erasmus family. That's a narrative of success. So a true common story, I would submit, Mr. President, involves both hurt, but also success and joy. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. William, and
Point
then
of order.
Kari.
Can I make a point of order?
Sure.
We are, just to clarify, we are talking about item 1. Would you
Yes.
be happy to remind the body that that's what we're
Why don't you
talking
do
about?
that, Daniel? Remind us of what we're talking about. Number 1.
Brothers and sisters, we are speaking, and if I'm not out of place, just reminding us gently that we are actually only currently speaking about recommendation 1, which is that Synod acknowledge the need for great sensitivity, discernment, and long-term commitment in addressing the legacy of the doctrine of discovery, particularly in addressing CRCNA mission work among indigenous peoples. Which means that we're not talking about the report as a whole or anything like that particularly.
11 speakers, starting with William and then Kari.
William Delman, Classis Alberta North. Mr. Chairman, I call for the question.
Question has been called. All in favor of calling the question, say aye. Aye. Opposed? The motion carries. Kari? Nope, he's off. Lenore?
These tall Dutch people. Lenore Main, Classes Hackensack. I speak for this motion. It is a motion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I especially appreciate the sensitivity, discernment, and all the other good things that you're looking to do. Because I think that without that, it's like someone has, like you have a husband and a wife going through a divorce, or someone has cheated on you, and they have not given you the opportunity to heal. And I think this gives them an opportunity to heal. So I thank you.
Thank you. Adrian?
Adrian DeLange, Classis Rocky. I speak in favor of the motion, and I'll just talk for a moment about why that is. I don't know what to do. The story that we read in the task force is not my story, not my personal story. It's a story that's news to me, even if it is a story that my Christian family and my ethnic heritage is a part of. But I speak so strongly in favor of this motion because it seems to me that, I speak so strongly in favor of this motion for the sole reason that our brothers and sisters in Classis Red Mesa were a direct part of this motion. And in a context where I don't know what to say, and when I'm so far removed, and in a conversation where we have so often talked about people who have taken their voices away, I believe, or have had their voices taken away, I trust in the wisdom of this committee that's brought together a number of disparate voices, including the very important voice of our brothers and sisters in Classis Red Mesa. And so for that reason, I speak in favor of the recommendation.
Thank you. Brett Pennings and then John DeVries.
Brent Pennings, Classis Atlantic Northeast. I'll try to be quick. I speak in favor of the motion. We need to begin the process. Coming from Syracuse, New York, we live close by Onondaga Lake, which belonged to the Onondaga Nation, which was taken away from them and severely polluted. And over the last 3 years, they've gone through the process of beginning to restore it to its natural, what it was like before it was polluted. So now we can actually swim in the lake and actually eat some of the fish. And there's some long-term damage that already has taken place. And at this point, I believe the Onondaga Nation does not have access to their own sacred burial ground. So there's ongoing systemic evil. And I think it's all over, and we need to begin this process. And I encourage you for going slow, because I don't think it's going to happen quickly. So I speak in favor. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett. John?
John DeVries, Classes Holland. I speak in favor of the motion, but I do have a question, clarification, specifically related to the first point here. I've heard a few times the designation of, I think I have this right, boarding school survivor. And my question related to that is that a designation, is that the accepted designation for all those who were at one of these boarding schools? Because the language to me, at least in my history, when I hear survivor, I hear Holocaust survivor, that kind of thing. And it almost says to me, these people have been traumatized. And while in various cases that may in fact be the case, I'm concerned that the other implication that makes is that people who have this designation or were giving this designation, even though they may be saying one thing, they've been traumatized, so we can't necessarily just go by what they've been saying. Does that make sense?
Most of your question I got. I sort of got lost a little bit at the very end.
Right. Well, is it the accepted designation for all those who have been at one of these boarding schools?
I'm going to speak, if it's okay, to the Canadian experience for a moment, and then I'll defer to Mike. Maybe would you be able to address the American part?
Can I just?
Yeah.
Let me just speak as chair here. That isn't in the motion we're voting on, that language, is it? Are we talking about language that's in our motion here?
No, it's been part of the presentation that was made, so that's why I'm wondering about
We're
it.
voting on the motion here. Let's vote on the motion. Let's keep our focus. I understand your concern about whether that's an appropriate designation, but that's not what's before us right now.
Okay, I just judged that it was
use.
part of our particularly addressing the CSNA mission work among Indigenous peoples, that it was part of that discussion, so that's fine.
We are ready to vote on the motion in front of us. Motion number 1. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries.
Our second recommendation then is that Synod acknowledge that the existing doctrine of discovery is a false doctrine, and we reject and condemn it. It helped shape Western culture and led to great injustices. Now, before I move it just briefly, I want to just share a little point of clarification that in the late 1400s, mid to late 1400s, when various Catholic popes created a set of doctrines that we now commonly refer to as the doctrine of discovery, they did not call it at that time the doctrine of discovery. It is now referred to in that way, but that was not always the case. So what we're talking about here in this recommendation is we're talking about a set of doctrines that were approved by the Roman Catholic Church, adopted by various other Christian parties throughout Europe, and is collectively known today as the doctrine of discovery. So I move recommendation 2.
All right, recommendation 2 is before us. Did you want to speak to that, Mike?
Yes, please. Mr. Chair, recommendation 2 flows out with some degree of consistency to recommendations D and E from the task force. And if I may, I'd like to mention some of the highlights in those, perhaps even verbatim.
I think he's asking to refer to some of the reasons for those being in there. Is that correct? You're not just going to read us the agenda, I assume.
Okay, well then I'll avoid that direction and just get to the point that I felt was critical to mention here. Our deliberations at the task force, particularly around the idea of repudiation, or however this reads, reject and condemn, We want to stress to you that rejection and condemning and/or repudiation is not a single act. So while you're doing this, please take note of the first recommendation that you've just affirmed, that this is a long journey. It was said a little earlier that it's important that we forgive and move on. Mr. Justice Murray Sinclair, the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, has said this: "This past is not over for us. We're still living it. So we can't move on from a past that lingers in the collective lives, particularly of Indigenous people. So as we enter into efforts to condemn this doctrine, I urge you to understand its seriousness and its continuing import in our collective lives as the body of Christ."
Thank you. Peter.
Peter Kornilov, Classes Hackensack. This is a question on wording, Mr. Chairman. If we believe that this is a false doctrine, why can we not use the word heresy? My trouble with this doctrine is that by consistently calling it a doctrine, it's a misnomer, it's a heresy. Why can't we call it a heresy? And can someone elucidate that for me, please?
We have seminary faculty for just such purpose.
Amen. Amen, brother. Amen. Would our most esteemed and apparently most intimidating professor who advised us be willing to speak to that?
You're making retirement look good. Heresy would be all right. I think heresy is normally reserved for doctrines, central teachings that are contradicted by some other teaching, and then the teaching that varies from the central teaching is a heresy. This is not a central teaching. This is a sort of a marginal expression of the church, and we're just saying that it's false. If you want to call it a heresy, that's fine.
Sure.
Could I make the friendly amendment that we call it a heresy, at least as a false heresy, or...
That would be a double negative, I think.
I believe the committee is considering whether that's a friendly.
Thank you for your patience, Mr. President. Yeah, we would consider that friendly.
So can you help us with the language then?
Yes, so then as I read it, it would now read that Synod acknowledged that the existing doctrine of discovery is a heresy, and we reject and condemn it. It helped shape Western culture and led to great injustices.
And should we put in the grounds that well, never mind, maybe not. All right, that is amended. It is still before us for discussion. We have a list of speakers. I think we're up to you, Hank. And then Joe.
Mr. President, we're being asked to acknowledge a certain doctrine, a doctrine of discovery. which has been described by our committee, researched, and presented as such to us. This is the doctrine of discovery. We did our homework by reading the Doctrine of Discovery report, but in doing that much homework, we're not ready to vote on this. We have one account of what the Doctrine of Discovery is before us. This is something that has been talked about a great deal. This is one account of it. There are other accounts. Most of us did not have enough time to do our homework well enough to understand whether this is a true account, a complete account of the Doctrine of Discovery. I do not disparage the integrity of the people who wrote the report. Please don't misunderstand me. I respect them a lot. But there are many other accounts of what this Doctrine of Discovery is all about and its significance. And that is not to dispute whether or not the settlers coming was a horrible experience. But we're talking about this doctrine. From this one account, I'm not sure I really know yet what the Doctrine of Discovery is. When I research things, I don't just read one account and decide whether it's good or bad on that account. So, with great fear as to the implications of what I'm saying, I say I have to vote against this.
Joe, and then Lee.
I'd like the chairman of our advisory committee to speak to the word existing. I assume there's a reason for it, that Synod acknowledged that the existing doctrine of discovery is a heresy. And in speaking to that word existing, this is part of my question. A doctrine is, I know this doctrine of discovery has implications that have lived on for a long, long time, and as the report tells us. But the doctrine itself is a doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church that was adopted at a certain time. Are you trying to counter that in some way by the word existing? And my recollection isn't super clear, but I thought that a subsequent decision of the Roman Catholic Church itself sort of repealed the doctrine, or at least replaced it with one that said quite the opposite. So what do you mean by existing? And are you referring to a statement of the Roman Catholic Church, or are you referring to something that has taken on a whole different life?
So you asked if the chair would be willing to address it. Our chair has a very, very, very non-existent voice at this moment. He has laryngitis.
I meant you.
So,
I meant
okay,
you, Mr. Reporter.
Okay.
And you.
Okay. I'll start us off, and then maybe Mike can continue. It is not true that the Roman Catholic Church has repudiated these papal edicts from the late 1400s and at mid to late 1400s, as far as I know. There has been talk about it, but they have not actually explicitly repudiated those doctrines, as far as I am aware. And so not only that, but this doctrine was not just a Roman Catholic doctrine, but rather it was adopted by many other religious faith communities during the Reformation. There are things enmeshed or embedded within the very legal framework of both of our countries, Canada and the United States, which explicitly or implicitly refer to this kind of theology, and that comes directly out of these edicts from the late 1400s. And so I'll let Mike carry on with that.
All right, just take note. There's lots of talk about this already in our agenda. Mike?
Okay, I'll be very quick then. Just to note that the doctrine of discovery as it exists is not what I'd call an existing Catholic doctrine. There are rulings of the Church in additional papal bulls which would, in a sense, supersede it. However, the implications, legally speaking and culturally speaking, in terms of the worldview of European superiority and its impact through the process of colonization and its continuing legacy, and the legacy of the Marshall Decision and the Royal Proclamation, all have existing implications legally and culturally.
So we have Lee and then Brian. Lee and then Brian.
Sorry, our faculty advisor would like to speak into this for a
I'm
moment,
sorry.
apparently.
We inserted the word existing because when we had the word false in there, we were afraid by saying that the doctrine of discovery was false, that some people would think we meant that it didn't exist, as opposed to saying that it wasn't true. So in order to make it clear that by saying it was false, we were saying that it wasn't true, as opposed to saying it didn't exist, we put in it was existing, but false.
Right.
Heresy, now that you're using heresy, you could take the existing out.
Lee.
Lee Kung, Classes Holland. My concern was also over that word existing, and I'm not making a motion or anything, but I was wondering if it would be okay if we considered maybe the existing legacy of the doctrine of discovery, just to make it a little more clear, because it seems confusing.
Did you want to make that a motion?
Okay, I make that a motion.
I don't think we would consider that friendly, because I don't, as reporter, I'm not really particularly interested in wordsmithing this on the floor of Synod.
All right, then. The speaker has made a motion that we change it to that Synod acknowledge that the existing legacy of the doctrine of discovery is a heresy. Is that supported? All right, that motion has been made and supported. We are now discussing an amendment.
May I speak to that for a moment then, too? If we change it to, if we put legacy in there, we are substantially changing the meaning of this recommendation. We are saying, in effect, by implication, we're saying that this doctrine no longer exists, and that all that is left is sort of the remnants, the leftovers. And that is not at all what the task force said, nor is it at all amenable to our committee, Advisory Committee 9. That is not the case. This doctrine still exists in many spheres of the world, and it has very, very real and current implications right now.
So we have no speakers on this amendment. Are we ready to vote? The amendment is to add the word legacy. Are we ready to vote just on the amendment of adding legacy? Are we ready to vote on this amendment? All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Aye. All right, that motion is defeated. We're back to the main motion. And folks, please, let's focus. I think we know what we're going to do with this motion. So let's focus and do what we're going to do. Brian and then Paul.
Brian Boersma, Chicago South. I've been told this is okay, so I'd like to call to cease debate.
Are you asking to cease debate, or are you calling the question? To cease debate. All in favor of ceasing debate, which means no more speakers. We will vote. All in favor of ceasing debate, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? We have ceased debate. We are going to vote on the motion. Kari, do you have a point of order? Sure. You better go to the mic so I can hear you.
Piece of information. The doctrine of discovery is actually two things. There is a religious doctrine and there is a legal doctrine in international law that entered the Supreme Court in 1823. So as we vote, we should simply acknowledge that we're talking about both.
Thank you for that point of information. We are now voting on the motion. Number 2. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? That motion carries.
Moving on then to recommendation number 3, that Synod recognize the gospel motivation in response to the Great Commission, as well as the love and grace extended over many years by missionaries sent out by the CRCNA to the indigenous peoples of Canada and the United States. For this we give God thanks and honor their dedication. So moved.
Is there any discussion on that motion? Joe?
Joe Campice, Classis Red Mesa. Mr. Speaker, I move that we would move all 3 through 7 at one time, since they were kind of written to tell a story. And what we're doing with our parliamentary process is kind of breaking that up. So if we could read all 3 through 7 together and then have discussion, if people want to share their stories of pain, if they want to talk about whatever it is, I think that would be most appropriate response.
Are you willing to move all of them together as a committee?
Yep.
All right, we will take 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 together as a group.
Okay, I will read them aloud for the body's pleasure. That came out way more awkwardly than I meant it. Okay, and anyways, recommendation 4, that Synod recognize the pain of those who suffered from their experiences in the residential schools of the U.S. and Canada, the ones in the U.S. sometimes being referred to as boarding schools, right? Including Rehoboth Christian School. 5, that Synod affirm the actions of Rehoboth Christian School in publishing its Statement of Confession and Reconciliation upon its 100th anniversary, and its promises and fulfillment of promises to serve well the diverse community in McKinley County, New Mexico. 6, that Synod celebrate the current culture at Rehoboth Christian School and at the Zuni Christian Mission School, along with the many stories of renewal, transformation, grace, and cultural exchange, as together God's people remain committed to mutual learning, encouragement, and healing. 7, that Synod direct the Executive Director to work with the appropriate agencies and offices in committing the CRC to walk alongside affected parties, listen to their stories, lament, and weep with them until such time as we can walk in beauty together. Just a couple of very brief notes on that. First of all, if you are wanting to read the confession, the Statement of Confession and Reconciliation from Rehoboth Christian School, it is available on their website. Just look for it. It is rcsnm.org/confession.pdf. So it is available. And secondly, that phrase, walk together in beauty, I understand or walk in beauty together, is a phrase that is rooted in indigenous culture from the Southwest. And so we use that specifically to honor their their culture and history in that way.
Did you want to speak, Mike? Yes, please.
Mr. Chair, for the information of delegates, number 4 that's been put before you, there are corollaries in our recommendation H as a task force. Secondly, in number 6, I would encourage you as a body to celebrate the amazing work of the urban Aboriginal ministries in Canada as well. And with respect to 7, just to draw your attention as delegates to elements of recommendations I and K from the task force. These are present in part in this recommendation number 7. And then with respect to number 5, this set of apologies comes from a 100th-year anniversary, which was mentioned in the blanket exercise, as you may recall. And there were 3 statements of confession and reconciliation that day. We recognize those as part of the journey of reconciliation in the Southwest. Those 3 statements came from Ron Pollender as superintendent of the day, who we've had the honor of talking with and meeting. Also came from Christian Reformed World Missions in the name of the person I am completely blanking. Thank you, John Rosenbaum. Home Missions, John Rosenbaum. And then on behalf of the indigenous people of that region, a statement of confession and reconciliation from our brother Stanley Jim. I underscore the fact that that apology is operative and important and part of an ongoing journey of reconciliation in the Southwest.
Thank you. We have Gail and then Tim.
Point of order, I'm not sure I actually said so moved. So moved.
All right, we better get it on the floor since we've been talking about it. So moved, it's on the floor. Let's keep talking. Thanks, Daniel. Gail and Tim.
Mr. President, Gail DeYoung, Classis Red Mesa. When people from Classis Red Mesa knew that I was coming, over and over they said, please tell the stories of love and grace and goodness that have happened in Rehoboth and in Zuni. And I could spend the rest of the day with you telling you those stories. But in deference to time, I will not. But I would like to tell you just a couple stories. And unfortunately, the first one that I want to tell is of a person who is no longer here. He's been sitting in the back this whole time, but had to unfortunately go to catch the plane. And so the first story that I want to tell is about Harry Deschini. And maybe some of you have had the privilege of meeting him. And is Harry here?
Back corner over there.
This is Harry, and I first met Harry many years ago when he walked into Rehoboth Church, the old Rehoboth Church, and he just looked around and he went, wow, this is what it looks like. This is part of what began my journey. And he proceeded to tell me the story. And I hope in this story we'll change the paradigm just a little bit of boarding school survivor, of children being snatched out of their homes. To be honest, if you have been in the land of New Mexico, you know it is very isolated. Homes dot the landscape. There is no continuation of neighborhoods. It's totally foreign to think of it as an urban setting because it's not. And so the truth of the matter is, how were we to provide an education, especially a quality Christian education, to the children of Classis Red Mesa? And some parents made very difficult choices of taking their children to Rehoboth and saying, we want this. And what a difficult decision that was. And in Harry's own life, that represented perhaps rejection, perhaps isolation, and it was something that took him years to overcome. He journeyed through alcoholism and beyond. And I read a little part of his story now. There was a very special lady at Rehoboth. She took care of me and seemed to understand my world's end. She held me tenderly, nurtured me, and got me off to school every day. I'm 58 years old now, and I still choke up as I reflect. This wonderful lady was from this church. Her name was Julia Ensink. And although I never got to see her again, within my heart, she left me, and I never left her. Harry has spent his time here finding out about this dorm mother that was his nurturing in this process. He found Julia's grave and went to visit it. He found her writings in the archives of Calvin and brought them to me and copied every single one, because that's how much this person meant to him. I tell you the story of Marv and Celia Apel. They were two precious dorm parents in the 60s who nurtured little children. And these were children who desperately missed their parents. But they did it with such tenderness and love. They left Rehoboth, they retired, came back to Michigan, but missed it so much that they came back down to Rehoboth to once more volunteer. And it was in one of those times of volunteering that Marv had a heart attack. And he lived for, I think, about a week, and then he passed away. And Cecilia's family came and said, "We want to take Marv back to Michigan, have his funeral here." And Cecilia said, "No, we will have his funeral and his burial at Rehoboth." The Michigan family did not understand, but they agreed. After the funeral, one by one, these dorm children that Marv and Celia had shepherded came, and they hugged her, and they said, "Marv was the only father that I ever really had. Marv was the one who taught me how to be a father." Those are just two of the stories that I can tell you from the dorms. Was it always perfect? No. But I stand before you with many names of people who came to love and people who came to share Christ. And I hope that that is not lost in what we are doing today.
All right, we thank you, Gail. We have another 13 speakers on the list at this time. If I thought we could reasonably get through that list before break, we'd give it a whirl, but I don't think we can. We're already past our normal break. It's 3:07. We're going to take a break until 3:25. I'm stealing a few of your minutes. 3:25. Let's be back and on the floor at 3:25.